Ph.D., 2006, and the Universal in the Realm of the Sensible, Edinburgh University Press and Columbia University Press, 2007. Her most recent books, Time in Feminist Phenomenology and Postmodern Philosophy and the Scientific Turn, are both forthcoming from Indiana University Press. They're out already.
The Postmodern Philosophy is out.
Dorothea, thank you so much for being here with us. It's moving, it's exciting. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Καταλαβαίνω λίγο ελληνικά, αλλά μιλάω λίγο και μιλάω λίγο ελληνικά, αλλά τώρα μιλάω αγγλικά.
And excuse me, how comes that you speak even a little bit of Greek?
I have been studying.
I studied. Remarkable.
And we appreciate different accents, but your accent is so great.
I want to tell you my secret. Okay.
Your origins. That's your secret?
No, I mentioned Polish.
Your first name is a little
Dorothea.
misleading.
Yes, my grandmother had the wisdom to give me a Greek name.
Great.
Okay, so before I start reading the formal paper, I want to say one word about something I've been thinking about a lot and spoke about recently with, I was in Israel giving a lecture, and I spoke about this a good deal with my friend Liat Friedman there, who teaches at Bezalel. And the question is, so what's the structure within which this is operating? And I would like to say that I think that structure is paradox. Okay? I think that's the Deleuzean structure within which what I want to say about nomadic events and the state. I think that the structure is a structure of paradox. And I would like to say that this is a general structure in Deleuze's work. It's not just here, but paradox is broadly evident in his work. Why would I say that? Well, first of all, I think that an important influence on Deleuze is Stoicism. And so Stoicism is, starting really young. Poor thing. He's actually very attentive, always. I imagine he's probably part of his So I would say Stoicism is a poetic way of life. It asks us not to be unworthy of what happens to us. It asks us to accept war and wounds and death, and even à la Deleuze, to long for death as an apotheosis of the will, as an aspect of the will. Thinking in this tradition for Deleuze is reason's need to actualize itself, and I would say that it is just as much the will willing itself to will. It's, in other words, pure activity. But this actualization of reason or will or judgment takes place for Deleuze paradoxically, in two opposed directions at once. And these opposed directions form a series, and this, of course, is what the logic of sense is all about. And these series resonate always in the vicinity of one another. And this resonance is the interference of two waves that travel in opposite directions in a medium. So, in the logic of sense, Deleuze understands this actualization of reason as sense, which is a system oriented in one direction towards appearances and in the other towards what he calls ceaseless spiritual activity, thought, thinking. And in one direction, language fixes its limits by naming, and in the other direction, there's an unlimited becoming. So it's the resonance of these two directions, I think, that provides Deleuze with the structure for much of his thinking. And what occurs along these lines then happens at the boundary between these two directions, right? At the boundary between things and propositions or bodies and incorporeal, always at that boundary. And there are many texts that one could go to in Deleuze to trace those boundaries. Today I've chosen perhaps one of the more dangerous ones given the current climate, and that is Deleuze's treatise on Nomadology. It's about to be published in the online journal Feminist, which I think there's open access to it, and you don't need a subscription, so it will be available there. Okay, so the paper itself. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari analyze the manner in which what they call deterritorialized flows of desire have been reduced to the state, to family, or to religious hierarchies. Matter, capital, and libido are among the flows of desire for which nature and human nature are processes of production. The authors argue that there is really only one process of desiring production, that now capitalism and psychoanalysis are inextricably linked.
Yeah.
It was good for us to have a room, but a seminar room.
People can find the...
εδώ. Εκεί εγώ.
Okay? Good?
Okay.
Everyone has a seat?
Okay.
Okay. So, Deleuze and Guattari argue that there is really only one process of desiring production, and that now capitalism and psychoanalysis are inextricably linked, and that the former produces subjective abstract labor, while the latter produces subjective abstract libido. So, although nothing exists outside of the socius, without its inhabitants, there is no socius. Quote, they are strictly inseparable and constitute one and the same process of production, end quote. This leaves one with the uncomfortable conclusion that social repression and psychic repression are one and the same mechanism. And insofar as the transition from primitive territories to barbarian despots to so-called civilized capitalists, which they refer to as state power, has proceeded lockstep, there is possibly no place else to go. Or even if there is another transition, it will only reinforce the forms of repression already in place. This is a serious concern. At most, what seems possible is a level of interpretive examination of the social processes, social machines, in which the user is caught up. This process, referred to as schizoanalysis, would have to begin by focusing not on ego and id, nor on the sexual or other organs, but on the partial elements of the unconscious, quote, a pure, dispersed, and anarchic multiplicity without unity or totality, the so-called molecular functions of the unconscious. Yet, it's clear that even to the extent that such an analysis is revelatory, and to the extent that this schizophrenic line of escape, that is, a nomadic distribution, is even possible as the process of a schizo, that is, one who is no longer an organized subject, who can no longer, quote, bear values, morals, homelands, religions, and private certitudes, end quote, it lies within and in relation to the socius. In other words, the schizophrenic investment is simultaneously a social investment, and it is the task of schizoanalysis to reach the investments of the unconscious in the social field. Initially, this calls for a negative task, violent, brutal, defamiliarizing, de-adipolizing, decastrating, undoing theater, dream, and fantasy. But the negative task remains within the libidinal field of the unconscious. So at the same time, the positive task is the discovery of libidinal investments in the social field, the social nomadic distribution, thus the nomadology, a social undoing of the organized and unified social field, a nomadic distribution of the socius that is not able to be captured by civilized capitalism. The question that emerges is whether or not this is actually the case. That is it possible to conceive of a social field that is not able to be coded by state, familial, or religious hierarchies, especially in the age of axiomatic capital? This section is called The Warrior God. In their treatise on nomadology, Deleuze and Guattari seek to examine the parameters of state and judicial power through the lens of Indo-European mythology. And to this end, they draw on the distinction between the Indian warrior god Indra and the figures Varuna and Mitra, the magician king and the jurist priest. They cite the scholar Georges Dumézil's thesis that going back to the 14th century, the magician king and the priest are interdependent and represent respectively decision and action, intelligence and will. Mitra, the reasoner, generally opposes blood sacrifice and upholds law, while his counterpart, Varuna, is identified with violence. But together, Varuna and Mitra regulate exchanges between those who make sacrifices and the gods. That is, they uphold the magico-religious ritual law and bind to the point of death those who succumb for an instant to their humanity by failing to deliver the promised, often human, sacrifices properly. Thus, they govern the realm of property, debt, and loan. That sounds like a very familiar figure to me, coming from the US, huh? From this situation, there emerges Indra, the warrior god, leader of a band of heroes whose economic and sexual morality is distinct from that of the rest of society. For the heroes violate contracts, lie to the god Mitra, and unfetter Varuna's legally bound victims. Quoting Marcel Grenet, Dumézil adds that throughout the world of this revolution, meaning the advent of the warrior, throughout the world, this revolution signals one of the great moments, constitutes one of the great openings of society to progress, end quote. Attuned to this revolution, this great opening, Deleuze and Guattari identify Indra with their concept, the war machine, which in itself remains outside of sovereign authority and prior to its legislative power, insofar as what they come to call the war machine in the guise of Indra operates against state power, both the sovereign and the law. They carry out this analysis in order to articulate the conflict between state power and its apparent adversary, nomadic power. A conflict that began with ancient societies, that is, the primitive territories, but continued through the reign of barbarian despots and up to the present day of so-called civilized capitalists. Their analysis leads to the not so surprising conclusion that although nomadic thought and action are relative to state thought and power, there are many more states and much more power than there are nomadic actors. And the latter may even be a necessary component of state power, which manifests itself in our laws, as much as in our academic, religious, and social practices. To augment their account of the warrior and the war machine, Deleuze and Guattari take up and compare the game of chess and that of Go, which represent not merely forms of amusement or fun, but also serious forms of order and organization with significant repercussions. Chess, they argue, is a game of state whose coded pieces have intrinsic properties determining their possible moves. Chess pieces bear specific names such as king, pawn, or knight, which determine the limits of their movements, their relation to all the other pieces and to the board. To this, let us add that chess is a hierarchical game whose object is to catch the king. Players aim to dominate the center of the chessboard, which has been compared to the sun at the center of the solar system. Playing pieces at the center have the greatest possible freedom of movement around the board, Thus, opening moves, of which 20 are possible, opening moves are very important. Once a player controls the center, they can expand their control to the edges of the board, because chess is a tactical game involving a single battle directed towards the specific end of putting the king in check. By contrast, Go pieces are anonymous, simple arithmetic units with no intrinsic properties, operating in constellations that function primarily to capture territory. Go is for this reason described as largely a game of strategy, a quote, imperial game where each player seeks to enclose more territory on the board than their opponent. A player has 361 possible opening moves, and we've learned recently, and possibly potentially infinite number of moves through the game, thanks to Google computers. Thus, or not, thus players are more often surprised by their opponent's moves and must constantly rethink their strategy, that is, their overall plan, for moving their playing pieces and for capturing territory around the edges of the board where it is easy to obtain, then moving to the center only much later. Thus, many battles may take place at the same time in different parts of the board, and players must quickly learn to diversify, to place playing pieces all over the board. Unlike in chess, Go pieces, which are simply smooth black or white stones, Go pieces are placed at the intersections of squares and not inside them, emphasizing that the stones surround the area they are capturing and do not really occupy it. Both are war games, but chess is an institutionalized, regulated, and coded war with front lines and rear skirmishes. It is arranged in closed space with clearly delineated sides that must be protected. The pieces maintain one-to-one relations with other pieces, so that together their moves constitute the game's overall stable and functional, and therefore stratified structure. Their intrinsic properties and qualities can be characterized as the subject of statements that become the subject of enunciation when spoken by the chess player, for example, bishop pair or king hunt. Thus, chess is semiological character as a system of signs. In a sense, the player, like a minister of defense, speaks as an institution through the chess pieces and from within the standpoint of their internal natures and intrinsic properties. Given their uniformity and anonymity, the Go pieces play a third-person function to the point that relations on the Go board are external to the playing pieces. The skirmishes of Go lack precise battle lines and are instead organized around constellations of units arranged in an open, homogeneous, smooth space, which originally belongs to no side. The point being to obtain and hold territory wherever possible, utilizing strategies such as bordering, encircling, or shattering the other player's held territory. Battles in different parts of the board take place independently of one another and are very difficult to coordinate. No matter how badly things appear to be going for a player, it's preferable to keep all options open as far into the game as possible, and under duress to head into open territory. Deleuze and Guattari address this strategy in a manner that implies the existence of warlike situations far beyond the board game. Quote, make the outside a territory in space, consolidate that territory by the construction of a second adjacent territory, deterritorialize the enemy by shattering his territory from within, deterritorialize oneself by renouncing, by going elsewhere. Quote. In fact, the juxtaposition of chess and Go serves a serious purpose. It is the image of the games played between state power and what they refer to as the war machine, which itself is an image of the relations between Mitra, Varuna, and Indra. The so-called war machine is not always or even usually actually engaged in bloody battles, but in various guises, intellectual, sexual, artistic, scientific, philosophical, it sets itself up in opposition to the order of the state apparatus, namely in opposition to the king, the priest, and the law. The question these two forms of play problematize is the question of the nature of creative and original thinking and acting, not only in relation to political power, but also in each of the social and creative spheres mentioned above. What problematizes their relation is that the two forms of conflict, the state and the war machine, the two games, especially when played on a grand scale, require one another. In the modern state, as in chess, at least since the time of Thomas Hobbes' great treatise, Leviathan, the more citizens obey, the more they are said to be free, because they have used their reason to follow the law, to operate internally within the confines of the law. By contrast, the Go player must be a thinker of the outside, sometimes violent, striking like lightning, and always discontinuous in appearances. But if the Go player operates with strategies of attack and retreat rather than lawful reason, what is the nature of this kind of thinking and acting? Is it with no paths or land, to territorialize and as quickly to turn around and deterritorialize, to think always in terms of continuous variations of variables, or is something more needed, something that can interfere with the big game played by the king, the priest, and the law on the one hand, and the nomad on the other? The section is called Phenomenology and Polis. Okay, so Deleuze and Guattari contrast the nomadic nomos culture, designated by the game of Go, the war machine that territorializes and deterritorializes, arriving from the outside, from the boundaries. They contrast this with state power, the polis, which codes and decodes space by means of institutions that impose values and laws from within. The point of this distinction seems to be that the warrior utilizes bands of playing pieces to ward off and prevent state power from forming. It's a reversal of Hobbes' Leviathan, where the power of a rational constitutional monarch must be absolute in order to manage the appetites and desires of the citizens. Nevertheless, the relation between the two is close. The Go player, the warrior, is not simply Hobbes' nature, the war of all against all. Dating back to the remote ages of humanity, there have always been so-called primitive nomadic cultures. Go players on the periphery of centralized states and its chess players, according to the law of the interior and the trajectories of the exterior. State sovereignty reigns over only what it can appropriate locally. Thus, its outside does not consist of other states, but can take the form of industrial complexes like big oil, religious formations such as Christianity or Islam, or media empires like News Corp or Disney. Or it arises as a new tribal society of local minorities, like the hippies described by Marshall McLuhan in an interview in 1994. I love this interview with him. He says, the hippies, they want nothing to do with our fragmented and specialized consumer society, living in the transitional identity vacuum between two great antithetical cultures. They are desperately trying to discover themselves and fashion a mode of existence attuned to their new values. Thus, the stress on developing an alternate lifestyle. We can see the results of this re-tribalization process wherever we look at our youth. Not just at hippies, he says. Take the field of fashion, for example, which now finds boys and girls dressing alike. And wearing their hair alike, and reflecting the unisexuality deriving from the shift from visual to tactile. Very interesting that McLuhan introduces the haptic, right, in this interview. The younger generation's whole orientation is toward a return to the native, as reflected by their costumes, their music, their long hair, and their socio-sexual behavior, end of quote. Okay, but this latter type of army is unstable, insofar as it consists of bands of warriors who congregate for war, then disperse, inhibiting the authority and power of a single leader. In this context, the war machine serves as a concept replacing the old words revolution or even social change. It is a game played by bands of persons, whether they band together to steal or to act in high society, formally exterior to rational law, but never truly independent. just as the state is never truly independent of either the global, well-organized, or regional tribal war machines. The Romanesque required careful cutting of stones so that a building might support itself by the strength of its shape and the cut of the stones, a series of successive approximations. Deleuze would already say. Stone cutting, or stereometry, is a descriptive geometry, a nomad science, that, like Go, calls for shaping forms to suit specific given conditions. Its principles involve construction based on drawn projections, specific instruments such as chisel and mallet, and rules for utilizing these in the correct order and manner. Thus, as has been pointed out, the object of the knowledge of nomad science is the behavior of the materials to be worked with, rather than the sedentary distinction between matter and form. That's from Bundes. Nevertheless, the application of these principles, quote, will depend considerably on the ingenuity of the designer. Of course, some cathedrals built by journeymen did collapse, but also in an effort to speed up production, state science appropriated aspects of nomad science to stabilize it. For the cathedrals, the state excluded the journeymen, utilized unskilled workers who followed templates to cut stones. It managed the construction sites, dividing theoretical and practical workers, both of whom were subject to sedentary state power. Thus, constants were extracted from variables and nomadic practices of the Go player. The placing of variables in a state of continuous variation disappeared. In the same manner, Edmund Husserl distinguishes the round as a vague nomadic essence from the circle, a theorematic fixed essence, and a constantly varying variable. Not surprisingly, Go, which is the Japanese name for the ancient Chinese game Weiqi, has been a favorite game of strategy of Chinese generals, statesmen, and literati from the former Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 8 AD, to the times of Mao Zedong. In his own writing, Mao compares the campaigns and battles of his guerrillas to the game of Weiqi, stating that both seek to dominate spaces on the board in the form of encirclement. Mao's particular game of Weiqi lasted 22 years and extended over all of China. Weiqi is essentially a protracted war whose formations are non-linear and discontinuous, where capture is achieved through encircling by many coordinated groups. As such, there is no secure front line or safe area in the rear, and victory is always relative to the territory encircled. This was apparently not only Mao's strategy, as those among us who still live with the memories of the U.S. war in Vietnam can quickly draw our own conclusions. Today, Go players exist in the form of extremely privileged persons of tremendous wealth and extreme political ideologies, the 1%, as much as among minorities, Black Lives Matter, the 99%, and armed bands opposing state power, for example, the recent militia takeover of an Oregon bird sanctuary in the USA. Clearly, the nomadic game is wide open to anyone capable of playing it. It needs not be what we in the USA like to call progressive. In fact, it may be deeply regressive, given the concern of so-called primitive societies to ward off or avert that monster, that is, the state apparatus, the conserver of mechanisms of power. Deleuze and Guattari argue that the war machine is supported by an epistemology that perpetuates nomad or minor science in opposition to royal or state science. But how? State science operates by setting up theorems. A theorem is mathematically defined as a, quote, statement that can be demonstrated to be true by accepted mathematical operations and arguments. In general, a theorem is an embodiment of some general principle that makes it part of a larger theory. The process of showing a theorem to be correct is called a proof. It's both from mathematics site, by the way. Incorporating one's definitions, then moving from definition to example, from essence to its properties. By contrast, the war machine problematizes. Deleuze and Guattari's treatise on nomadology is organized with axioms, propositions, and problems. Axioms are defined mathematically as self-evident propositions, true without proof, and propositions are simply statements that may be able to be logically true or false, except in the case of paradoxes, which is why Deleuze emphasizes paradoxes, which is why that's his structure. Problems are merely exercises whose solution is desired. And as I have argued elsewhere, Deleuze in problematizing philosophy is setting it in motion, making no claims about the nature of the world, providing no taxonomies or hierarchies of its inhabitants, no claims about what is or is not true. In this,
derives a dynamic relationship between sedentary power and schizophrenic lines of light and nomadic thinking. But my question would have to do with power in this sense. We know that for Deleuze and Guattari, the state apparatus is a principle of sovereignty and control, whereas the nomad war machine is a principle of becoming and movement. But as you very aptly developed for us, they require one another. And my question is how the question of critical agency emerges from this mutuality, this complicity between the two, and if there is any space for the question of power to be raised. Because my fear maybe would be the following: isn't there a risk of overlooking power relations which do not pass directly via the state apparatus? Isn't there a danger of reducting or reducing power to the state? I mean, or even I could push even further this thought by saying or asking, is any static and sedentary and ossified way of being and thinking to be equated or associated with the state?
precisely the latter.
Okay.
So it's not a thing, it's an organization.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not this or that government. I mean, the McLuhan example is interesting because McLuhan says, what if the hippies, right, come back as a state power? You know, what if they return as a kind of state power, which seems unimaginable, but is entirely possible. The reason I cite billionaires is because if you look at the way very, very wealthy people exist, they exist completely outside of the law, completely outside of, and yet they return, right, as another kind of state power. So the National Rifle Association, for example, another kind of state power. So it's not simply political. It also, I mean, he attributes it to, Oedipal psychoanalysis. Right? He attributes it to an Oedipalized psychoanalysis. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere where there is this theorematic procedure where you state, right? You state a certain set of true and false propositions. You provide definitions, very philosophical. You provide definitions, and then from those definitions, you state a set of true and false propositions, and then you use that as a way to organize yourself. Right? Intensive concept, which is described as an event in the pure sense. Events have meanings that are given formally without denoting lived experience or even scientific states of affairs. Thus, events lack conditions of reference in general. They consist of multiple variations, but their consistency is defined by internal components, internal to the sign in which they appear. This is the difference between prescribing all the rules and laws for establishing an institution, then setting them in motion, like a constitution would, and describing the workings of society from inside, how all of its shifting, functioning, and non-functioning parts race, class, culture, geography, education, wealth, how they relate to one another internally. Likewise, it is the difference between characterizing Deleuze's own philosophy as an instantiation of, for example, chaos theory, which would then be applied to every problem as a formal theorem, and Deleuze's own stated preference for axioms, propositions, and problematics. The methodology of problematics situates the intensive concept outside of the mundane propositions in which it might have been enshrined, as well as outside of the propositional functions, variable, and truth value of prospects, that is to say, outside of formalist logical principles. This model was formulated first, I think, by Jean-Paul Sartre as the nothingness of being that leaves us condemned to freedom, and more recently by Michel Serres in terms of the Phenomenology. The concept of atoms falling in the void, the smallest angle by which the atom deviates from the straight path. Rather than following a determinate path prescribed by a causal sequence of events, atoms swerve and commence a movement that appears to snap the bonds of fate, the everlasting sequence of cause and effect. From this point of view, to exist, to be a being, is to escape the causal determination of the past. It is to deviate moment by moment, where each new moment is an effect of the past but breaks completely with that past, which can then be defined as nothingness. Deviation from a state of equilibrium that is mute, motionless, and passive, governed wholly by natural forces, begins with what Serres refers to as laminar flow. The non-turbulent motion of a fluid in layers of smooth space. Now in water, laminar flow is water flow in which the streamlines remain distinct and in which the flow direction remains approximately parallel without any cross currents or eddies. But at velocities, at speed, right, the streamlines become non-parallel and the momentum becomes chaotically distributed, giving way to disorder, that is, to turbulence. Yet even in movement, there is stability, as exemplified by Plato's spinning top in the Republic. The faster it moves, the more it rests on its bottom point. It moves by translation. Every point on its body moves in the same direction at the same speed. Its axis may lean without tipping the entire top. It may rock, oscillating around a point. It both moves and is at rest. I have a little top at home. I meant to bring it, but of course I forgot. Enough things already packed. Archimedes' text on plane equilibrium situates the clinomen as a very small angle of deviation from balance or equilibrium, from mathematical zero. The clinomen is a differential such that whatever exists must do so as a deviation from a fixed position, as a displacement in relation to zero. Philosophically, this means that we do not work with reason, science, or hands, except through deviation from equilibrium. Everything is deviation from equilibrium, except nothing, that is to say, according to Deleuze, what's our identity? Actually, sorry. The problematic in philosophy, as in science, is for this reason called an affective dimension of thought, insofar as it does not proceed according to rational theorematic procedures, but occurs as the event, as the effect of, quote, metamorphosis, generations, and creations, end quote. An insurgency within philosophy, or within sciences themselves, as they are routinely carried out. As events, problems, exercises whose solution is desired, constitute the war machine of nomadic science and nomad philosophy. As the nomad, the Go player, the warrior exerts pressure on the state from outside, the state is reproducing itself, ensuring identity and public recognition. It is on guard and always ready to appropriate what it can of nomad thought, even while repressing or banning or marking as irrelevant what it cannot use. Think of how often this happens in philosophy, where one must always address the status quo, those professional philosophers who have become authoritative and who preserve and perpetuate the centrality of their expertise in order to ensure that thinking which problematizes what everyone knows to be the case is restricted or silenced. Anything to prevent turbulence and constrain movement. As in solid physics, fluids are reduced to solids, measured and hierarchized, defeating the turbulence. I think this is the last section. Does the nomad need the state? Does nomad science need royal science? Now, Serre argues that Leibniz's psychology of freedom remains linked to the declination of atoms in the void, the infinitesimal angle of the trajectory, and the imperceptible rupture of spatial symmetry, because both identity and indiscernibles, that is, entities impossible to clearly distinguish, regulate his universe so that, in fact, indiscernibles cannot be identical. Nevertheless, atoms tend indefinitely towards stability, but it is the stability of their conjunction, their joining together in decline. In other words, for Serre, stability is as transient as the bodies and worlds they formed. Serre argues, following Lucretius, that, quote, the world, objects, bodies, my very soul, are from the time of their birth adrift. They irreversibly fall apart and die, end quote. And so our soul, an amalgam of atoms and the void, is mortal. Quote, he says, the universe as it is, as it goes on, as it transforms itself, is mortal. The earth shakes and the house falls. All conjunctive tissue is sapped by the void, and only the void is immortal like the particles, end quote. Deleuze and Guattari, by contrast, and more subtly, focus on Serre's statement that, quote, nothing may be seen or thought to be inclined without reference to something that is not inclined. A water leader, a plumb line, a measuring stick, a cube in space, a Euclidean system, end quote. To this list, Deleuze and Guattari add the war machine, which is invisible without a state. And this implies that ontologically, the relation of the nomad and the state, the Go player and the chess master, it implies that they are a single field of action. For its part, the state appropriates the nomadic essence, inexact but rigorous, while the nomad cuts loose the contents of royal science. Are we too quick to subvert the nomad to the state? The nomad is not pre or post-state. Its procedures are not pre or post-state. Go is not pre or post-chess. Rather, nomad thought is that arena in which the scientific field, the philosophical position, the aesthetic or political or sexual field is problematized and so appears in an entirely different manner. It can be said that the state produces idealizations, ideal circles, ideals of beauty, ideals of social contract, ideals of sexual norms. And the nomad replies with round things, graffiti, tribalism, polymorphous perversity. Yet Deleuze and Guattari are not sanguine about this relationship. As academics and intellectuals know only too well, the state avoids empowering them, but hopes to make them dependent, giving them an imaginary autonomy, while their real task is to reproduce what is already known. Yet somehow some of them continue to make trouble, to reorganize the given field of forms that organize matter and matter prepared for forms. Nomad thought does not prepare matter which, when problematized, is already a form of content, and form is always already a chosen matter of expression. This is not materialism. It requires that we understand that this theory of problematics, the theory of the Klineman, utilizes differential equations which articulate the decline of atoms and are inseparable from the intuition of variation. This means that rather than producing theorems, nomad concepts are singularities, always in variation. In physics, a singularity is that point at which there's a breakdown in the geometrical structure of space and time. The most obvious case is the Big Bang, 13.7 million years ago. But collapsing matter forming a black hole is also thought to have a central singularity. There is no way to causally determine the future of a black hole based on its causal past. And given its theoretical counterpart, the white hole, there would be no way to causally determine anything that might emerge from it. The concept of singularity is a theoretical construct tied to the theory of general relativity, but the Deleuze extend it conceptually to mind. In thought, the singularity is a problematic theoretical construct that deviates from the theorematic. Structure breaks down, and both the causal past and the causal future are indeterminate, which means they are situated as varying variables. Thus, although royal science established itself in relation to the theory of universal gravitation, a constant relation for all variables, measuring no more than two bodies at a time, problematic, new fields in physics seem not to be reducible to the model of gravitational forces. Why then should philosophy or art or politics or sexuality be any different? Something always prevents the nomad from being completely introjected into the state, granting them the position of a minor voice. Nevertheless, the cathedrals at Orléans and Beauvais collapsed at the end of the 12th century, and the state called out for control in the name of safety. Yet, in the interactions between nomad and state science, it appears that the former invents problems whose scientific solution depends on the manner in which royal or state science theorizes the situation and organizes the work that materializes it. We can say the same for thinking. The signifying chain at some point will be theorized in relation to true and false propositions, so claims Frege. The two games are always being played simultaneously. So the big question remains, can thought be extracted from the state model? Can we play Go without playing chess? Can nomadic warriors exist apart from state order? We accept that there are two kinds of sovereignty, one for the imperium, or authority founded on mythos, varuna, and the other the legislative and juridical logos, mitra. There may persist an event between them. Keep in mind that in modern philosophy, it is thought which invents and validates the fiction of a state, which separates murderous rebel subjects in Hobbes' nature from rational consenting subjects, serving in this way as the moral center of rationality. As the state extends its authority in thought, it also sanctions thought as a unique and universal form. What this means is that philosophy or sociology or psychoanalysis are state forms of thought, and that the less attention we pay to the role of thought, the more conformist it is likely to become. However, it's also the case that the state is a contingent development that might not have appeared. Keep in mind that nomad thought is not an effect of the state. It is a force that appears to remain relative to state thought, possibly without being able to undo it. For every warrior, for every tribe, there are many more states and much more state power, manifesting itself in our laws as much as in our academic, religious, and social practices. Yet the war machine is not necessarily seeking war or revolution, only displacement, like Moses launching into the desert, tapping our toe, reviling and refusing language, each seeking to evade appropriation by the state and its figures, the king, the priest, and the lawmaker. But sometimes, in the end, the nomad, including billionaires and the NRA, returns countering an even more massive state. So which will it be for us? Will we be returned from a nomadic line of escape with an even more powerful state than that which we fled? Can we play our game against the state in the form of guerrilla or minority action, risking having our thought and action adapted by the state and used against us? Can we refuse to speak and write in theorems, utilizing a creative line of escape, making war by creating something else? Whichever our trajectory, this is not to go up against the state. It is rather to persist in relationship to it. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dorothea, for this stimulating and effectively intensive account of Deleuze's treatise on nomadology. And if I may, I'd like there is more room for deterritorializing the state. So that's my, yeah.
That's, I mean, just, utilizing the structure that Deleuze provides, which is that notion of paradox. There's always these two directions at once, and they move in different directions. One towards greater stability, the other towards undoing that, towards, not really just even undoing that, but re-problematizing.
Right.
So that's much more than undoing. This is their use of Marx and anti-Oedipus, which is just brilliant, I mean, it's just absolutely mesmerizing to me how they use Grundrisse in anti-Oedipus. And I don't think anti-Oedipus could have been written without that. It certainly would have been a much different book. It's just, of everything in anti-Oedipus, that's what grabs me the most. That's what really just, I find it very, very effective and really, really powerful. But nevertheless, they're proposing, but on their own terms, I would argue, a paradoxical structure, right? Not a Hegelian structure, as you know, of course. I mean, there's nothing worse for Deleuze and Guattari than Hegel. Sorry, but that's the truth. And so there's no way that they're going to embrace that model. They simply cannot embrace that model, even as they embrace the structural understanding, the historical structural understanding that Marx has so beautifully provided.
Well, first, as a praise for your presentation, I will quote Heraclitus, "Τα πάντα ρί και ουδέν χωρί" is the first effort to put the movement, the motility in the center of the thought, probably creating a nomadic subject before of itself. But that is the second, the answer, my second quote, is old, but not so much old. It's 30 years ago, 35 years ago, in Laborde, with Guattari, where we used to think together the political with the movement outside of the ego, outside of psychoanalysis, a movement to psychoanalysis. And what we would discover is that was a big resistance from the ego to appropriate, to assimilate all the other powers that were around him in the world, in the lines of light, or whatever. So, 30 years after, in the position I'm now, you know that we have a very big problem, a big crisis in our country, a political crisis. I wonder if nomadic thought is accountable to polis. If we must again think together political with subjective thought, which for me is ad loco parent in the place of an answer to our problem today, is ad loco parenti of the melancholy of the left, for example, because left is not finished, not exhausted. We think about the left all the time. I don't know how it is in America, but in Greece we really do. So that is my answer. If the nomadic subject begins from an implicated point and goes to an explicated point, can we think of the nomadic subject without thinking his embeddedness, his embodiment, and his engender situation? And if we can do all that, can we turn to the nomadic thought as a way, as a line of flight, as a flight away? That is my answer.
Well, as some of you, at least one person in this room knows, I have trouble with the notion of a nomadic subject. The goal pieces are anonymous. They're smooth, colored stones, black or white. They have no agency. They don't inhabit any particular territory. They are situated on the cross lines of the grid, and individually they accomplish nothing, but rather the whole idea behind the game is to surround a territory and then, if necessary, get out of there as fast as possible, right? So that I really don't know what I question. It doesn't seem to me that the process of nomadic science produces a subject, but rather the fact that it's situated right in juxtaposition, paradoxically in juxtaposition to where a subject has been formulated and formed, and that is in the stabilization, right, on the other side of the paradox, in stability and stabilization and identity. So in that sense, if those two sides are always operating semiotically as well as in other situations, but especially semiotically, then the self is always being undone. It's always being surrounded by external forces and undone, but always reforming as well, or certainly always reforming. So it seems to me that nomadic subject doesn't exist, that there's no such thing.
Add something that we shouldn't conceive the war machine as a reaction to state paradox. It is not a reaction to state war machine. Because
That's what I said. I said that. Yes.
yeah, I'm saying because we are in the real form of organization of desire. Because for Deleuze, the power is not prior for the social field, but always already constituted by lines of light, the social field. So our problem is to have a different form of organization of always already a schizophrenic desire. This is prior and not the power.
I may be misunderstanding your question, but again, I resist making the nomadic into a thing. Right? It's a process. It's a process, it's not a thing. So even if you talk about nomadic desire, doesn't quite make sense to me in the same way nomadic subject doesn't quite make sense to me. Because desire belongs to the realm of stability, unless you're talking about, of course, machinic desire, right, which is just this free-flowing, unorganized energy. Perhaps an unfortunate, it's not unfortunate that it's called desire, but the whole point of it is that it has no telos, it has no aim and or goal, it has no organization, it's simply energy, right? It's energy. And therefore, it's nature's pure forces, if you will. It's perception and affection that have been deprived of a subject and are just pure force, pure power in that sense. So again, to speak about nomadic desire seems to miss the point of the nomadology. If it were desire, other than desiring machines, okay, I qualified that, other than this concept of desiring machines, which is actually not oriented towards anything, without aim and or goal, right? It's not non-Aristotelian in every possible sense. So it's kind of a paradoxical statement in and of itself to talk about machinic desire, but nevertheless, that's the terminology being used. to talk about nomadic desire, once again, I'm not quite sure what that would be, except if you wanted to equate it with machinic desire, which is nature's pure forces organized according to natural laws. Couldn't be anything more than that.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. There are a lot of things that I would like to discuss with you, but on this subject that came up about desire, the nomadic subject and all this, there could also be a solution of Whitehead, in a way, of Whitehead, who has this notion of subject-superject, and Deleuze sort of quasi-uses it in his late work, which is exactly what you said, that the self is continually undone and reformed, so there's always a creative moment, but he still uses a sort of notion of a subject, which I think in a way is isomorphic in a way with what you call, based on logic of sense, the paradox. This being the two sides that require one another, the processes, the psychic and the capitalistic processes are one and the same thing, which is in a way also Spinozistic problematic. What does this one and the same thing mean? So if you totally disperse with the notion of a subject in the nomadic, then where do you end up? Because you have this plane of immanence, okay, which is like this total plurality, but on the other hand, you have the formula of monism equals pluralism. So, I mean, this tension, I think, to be resolved or to be thought of, requires a moment where the lines of flight actually cross one another, and you have something there. You have a subject that disappears, but you have a subject, no? Even if it is constantly uncreated and redeveloped and reformed and re-territorialized and deterritorialized, but I don't see how you can just do away with the crystallization. Even the last thing, even the example of the constitution, the political constitution, I mean, you can take it as an axiomatic that sort of, but it is still part of a crystallization of a process. So even then you have both things at once. The constitution gets created as a crystallization of lines of light, then it gets undone, and so on and so forth. So we have to think, what you say, the two things at once in a way. But by doing away with the subject or the concentration or the crystallization altogether, then we're just lost in a sea of immanence in a way, I guess.
In the cinema books, Deleuze uses the notion of crystallization to conceptualize a pure image with no tail, with no purpose, with no purpose. It's just the pure, it's just the...
Excuse me very much.
It's the image in which what came before has no relationship to the image itself, and what's coming after has no relationship to itself. So once again, causality is cut on both sides. Okay, that's crystallization. So it's not the forming of the subject; it's the forming of a pure, absolute, pure visual image with no before and no after. Yes, Deleuze uses Whitehead, but he's not Whitehead. He uses Bergson, but he's not Bergson. He uses Peirce, but he's not Peirce. In other words, Deleuze's use of any and every philosopher is, as he himself notes over and over again, unique. I'll leave it at that. Right? So there's no question in my mind but that there are multiplicity of philosophers and philosophies that Deleuze makes use of. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to read Deleuze, because you're supposed to know everything, right? It's really horrifying after a while. But nevertheless, he never uses it in the form he receives it. Never. Not ever. There's no way he ever does it. So, when I say that, this is why I began by talking about Deleuze's Stoicism and the idea of the paradox, in which there are always two directions, bodies with their mixtures and states of affairs, which are causes for other bodies on the one side, incorporeal entities, events with sense on the other, right? Always situated in relationship to one another, and everything occurs at the boundary between things and propositions, bodies and incorporeal, to eat and to speak. That's exactly where the action is for Deleuze. So again, I would say that if you want a subject, that subject is on the side, it's in the place of true and false propositions, right? It's situated in the realm of true and false propositions, whereas, which Deleuze says, too bad, Frege, I like sense, I'm going with that, all right? I'm going with the event, I'm interested in the pure, I'm interested in the becoming, I'm interested in the thing that, in what is not a thing. So I don't see any in Deleuze's, in the way he lays out his concepts, I don't see it now. I don't see it at all.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I would like just to raise, to give an illustration of the point my two colleagues just did about subject and about identity. You did mention Michel Serres and also de Mézil. They have a very interesting interpretation of the process, because you referred to a process of moving from feudalism to capitalism. De Mézil says that a stratified society, feudal society was a stratified society, as you mentioned, with warriors, kings, the priests, and the laboratories, the people who work, the people who ruled, the people who prayed, the people who worked. Now, in between, you have a new subject emerging. That is the merchant, mercatores, oratores, laboratories, and you have new subject, mercatores, which is the capitalist. Michel Serres names him Quirinus, uses the Latin. So there you have a new subject emerging in a process from feudalism to capitalism. There you have the desire of the merchant to become an aristocrat, because when he makes money, he wants to become an aristocrat. He buys land, he buys the title. We've seen it in Molière. That is the point I think my two colleagues are raising. You need the subject in order to understand the process. You need desire in order to understand the process of becoming. That is not an ossified identity. It is an identity that is fluid, and it feeds on the contradictions existing within the feudal society in order to move to a new society, which is capitalist society, and it needs a state to do that. That is why you need a constitution that protects bourgeois property rights. You need also the legitimation of the state. That is how it is done, and that is an illustration of the point raised.
Okay. I would say that what you're offering is a historical analysis. Deleuze is not offering a historical analysis. He's not interested in history. It's not about history for him. This is about the organization, about how certain, even mathematical structures, I've argued. I have an article that was published in the British Journal of Phenomenology a couple years ago, capitalism and calculus. And essentially, Deleuze's argument for the formation of capitalism has
desire immediately belong to state politics, or at least they characterize state politics. And indeed, if we want to understand nomadic thought, then we shouldn't just put in a dialectic state politics. In a sense, we should think that nomadic thought does not exist to unbound state politics, but it's just an exit a procedure that exits desire images and idealizations, or at least the best way to think about nomadic thought, exactly because we shouldn't put it into that kind of dialectics and dualisms. But I was wondering, and this is the point that I think that I'm repeating the same exact things, that for any nomadic thought to initiate, to start, we already need a desired image. Like, nomadic thought presupposes desired images in a sense, and this, if such thing exists, then there is a strong concealment here that nomadic thought does not have a desiring image. And I think that this concealment is what, let's say, stigmatizes Deleuze ontology. Because I have this feeling that, let's say, state politics have already embodied nomadic thinking since the 70s, is the time that Deleuze was writing. And at the same time, every nomadic thought has conceals the most strong desiring images of accomplishments, of success, of establishments. Give an example in pose, for example, someone that makes a graffiti, like there's indeed this desiring image of establishment, establishing one's identity and one's mark on the wall. And the same with hippies. Like, we shouldn't imagine like hippies without a state regime of some kind. Like, that would be very frightful to live in a regime where hippies rule the state. Anyway, indeed, I'm repeating exactly the same things, but let's say with a not exactly like with investment in the subject. I don't know if you want to add something.
Could I add something?
I'm not exactly sure what your question is. Okay. You know, the stone cutters who were cutting stone for the cathedral in situation like stone by stone, cathedral by cathedral, pre-existed the state that took them over. Right. The implication is that whatever you want to call it, life, pure activity, is always there. It's always there, whether we pay attention to it or not. So it's always there, doing its own thing, so to speak, independently of state power, even though it exists outside of any relationship to state power. It still doesn't go, oh, please, can I have permission to do this thing which you have no interest in, state, you're a big state. But because initially the state has no interest in any nomadic activity. Now, I'm not going to use the word subject, but I'll say, all right, it's activity, let's say. Or Deleuze's term, event. The state has no interest in any nomadic event, zero. Unless somehow, something is happening there. And they start to notice and they go, oh, we want some of that. Except we want to codify it. Right? We want to turn it into a true and false proposition. We want it to be logically pure. We want it to be systematic. We want it to be hierarchical. But prior to that, these things arise all the time. Why? Because of desire, machinic desire. It's always going on. Nature and human nature are one and the same. Machinic desire is always happening, everywhere, all the time. And it's only occasionally that the state even bothers to notice it. When usually, not when it's, usually when it wants something from it, takes something from it. So,
like a mechanical mimetics of the nature,
nature and human nature, Deleuze says, are one and the same. Let's not make a distinction, you're right. And that nomadic event, that activity is always taking place, all the time, always happening. And it's only under certain circumstances that it's even noticed. And sometimes those nomadic events, you're absolutely right? Those events all of a sudden acquire a subject from the other side. And then they become instantiated as one other version of the state. But nomadic activity continues everywhere, all the time. It's always going on, whether we notice it or not. Why? Because nature and human nature are one and the same. And that's the nature of what he calls machinic desire. Nature, natural, pure activity.
So take one more final question, Panagiotis.
Oh, thank you for the presentation. And well, there is in the entire treatise of nomadology, there is a word constantly coming again in the leading titles, which is exteriority. And I was wondering whether this is something that has to be problematized, the very notion of exteriority. Exteriority was part of the intellectual and political milieu of exactly the period that the treatise of nomadology was written. It was part of the big debate on the state, external, inside, outside, it had some. But I was wondering, I always take as a starting point Spinoza here. In Spinoza, there's no exteriority. When in the political treatise, he says that hoc ius quod potentiam studius definitur imperium appellare, etc. This is that the potential of the multitude, that is basically anything that includes the entire, all this entire potential or practices, or including the nomadic aspect, are in a certain sense the definition of the imperium, depending upon their intensity or potentiality, which means if even in their 0 degree they also. I wonder if this gives a different sense to exteriority. Exteriority as a modality, not as a special metaphor, which is also very interesting in which way we can use the very notion of nomadic, anything associated with nomadic and the war machine. Is it so exterior to the state, or is it part of the same, or is it at the same, let's say, not just kind of image, it's ontological, but also the same nexus of forces? That's my question, whether this very notion of exteriority should be slightly at least problematized.
I don't know, throughout this treatise, Deleuze and Guattari say that it's a single field between the state and the nomad. It's a single field. I say it over and over again. Now, conceptually, there's a huge difference between problematization and theorems, right? Logical theorems, true and false propositions. There's, in those terms, there's an exteriority in that a proposition refers to a state of affairs outside of the proposition. It seems to me that that's an example of what they mean by exteriority, reference, denotation, classic, whereas sense does not. Sense remains in the sphere of immanence. So, I would say it's something along those lines. If there is one last guy who had a question, perhaps we could get to him. Go ahead.
It came to my mind that somehow I see an analogy, but I don't mean it like analogy because the fandom of Deleuze will
You'd be very uncomfortable with that. Yeah.
But anyway, how in my mind I have that, as I understood it.
An image of thinking?
Yeah.
Does that work for you? Okay.
The nomadic activity, as you described it, it reminds me a little bit of queer, but as Butler theorized. I mean, no identity. And I wonder, what do you think about this?
I think she's doing something really different. I was particularly outside of what Deleuze is doing towards she always objected to Deleuze, and I'm pretty sure that hasn't changed.
Just a minor think I would like to draw on Panagiotis' comment, and I keep thinking all the time that my Foucauldian self is absolutely comfortable with the gesture of dispensing with the subject. But what about accounts with which you would be more comfortable? Or you think that this is complicit to the ontology of the subject? You think this? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Just checking.
What would be the point on the side of the paradox where there isn't anything to? I mean, he does say that, there was that long quote about how we have to deterritorialize even ourselves, but where do such organizations come from, right? Where do they come from is the question. And, this was the frustrating thing for the Americans, for example, about Vietnam. They could never figure it out, right? Because all their models were state models. Everything they had was a state model. And they could not understand these anonymous individuals rising up out of the bush and disappearing back. They couldn't get it.
Anonymous for the Americans. Anonymous for the Americans. They were not anonymous. These people, they were seen as anonymous.
Right, anonymous for the Americans.
Perceived as anonymous.
Yes, I would agree with that. But I mean only anonymous in the sense that they weren't organized the way the American troops were organized. I don't mean it about who they are as individuals. I only mean the way in which they were organized. Whereas the Americans have this, right, their military hierarchical, very hierarchical organization, and you take orders from the next guy, and who takes the next guy, all the guys, top, commander-in-chief, blah, blah, blah. But I mean anonymous in terms of organization, not in terms of humanity.
Okay, this is a little moving for me, I have to confess, because our mutual friend, Takis Bundas, wanted to be here with us today. He's in Canada. He had a medical thing to deal with. And you all know that Takis was very pivotal in the organization of this conference that we held here at Pantheon 2 years ago, and Dorothea was also here. And I think it was an amazing event overall.
It was amazing.
So Takis asked me to read to you, to all of you, a letter addressed to Dorothea. My dear Dorothea, when in the 70s you and I met in Toronto and New York to plot how best to take over the North American academic establishment in the name of Deleuze, we had no idea that I, a renegade, will be dreaming in my old age of a motherland that I left behind, or that you would be now discovering its many charms. I had wanted to be with you today, mesmerized at the naive, in Deleuze's sense, proclamation that nomadic lines of escape are still possible, but alle men voulaient anthropon, alla δε Theos και Levi, the will of mortals, that is, differs from the will of gods. You have done more for Deleuze studies than I was able to do, and there is still more for you ahead. There's no tint of jealousy in this, only admiration and collegial pride. The day must have been a good one for you. You found yourself in the nest of Poulantzas readers and admirers, and you survived their challenges. I wonder whether I could contribute from afar to the special character of the moment with a gift to Pantheon and to you. I decided to donate my philosophy set of books to the Pantheon Library in recognition of the high quality of the scholarship of the dedicated scholars there who chose to stay and fight instead of running and establishing themselves elsewhere. Would you do me the honors and allow your name to stand next to mine in an inscription that, with the permission of the university, will read, Donation of Konstantin Bundas and Dorothea Olkowski. Hugs to you and greetings to all. May Greece continue to attract you and Deleuze to beguile you. Kostas Bundas.
Αυτό το χειροκροτάμε.
at the